Everything you have learned so far might be mistaken. There may be details about the Sabbath that your church has not shared, and this could be keeping you from enjoying a complete relationship with God. Are you unknowingly violating a commandment and leaving your worship unfinished? The Bible holds the truth, yet it remained concealed for many centuries. The Sabbath is more than just a day. It is an important spiritual enigma, and once you understand it, your faith life will be completely different. Jesus Christ shared little-known facts about the Sabbath, and today you will learn how this understanding can change your relationship with God forever. Pay close attention, because the enemy does not want you to understand this. He has kept millions of Christians misinformed, trapped by man-made traditions and rules. If you seek deliverance and wish to experience complete faith, stay with me until the end, as the next few minutes might completely alter your spiritual life. Are you prepared to hear the 3 biblical truths about the Sabbath that can advance your walk with God? Then let's begin. First, consider the Sabbath in the Old Testament, which was a command given only to the Jews. From the earliest chapters of the Bible, the Sabbath is presented as a special day when God created the world. He set apart the 7th day, rested, and made it holy. Genesis 2:2-3. However, something notable is that at that time, God did not issue a direct order to humanity to observe that day. The narrative merely describes God's rest. This prompts us to ask, was that day intended for all humanity from the start, or was it later made a specific commandment? Many note that before Moses, there are no clear records of figures like Adam, Noah, or Abraham keeping the Sabbath. However, the lack of evidence does not prove that it was never observed. The Sabbath makes a strong comeback in the history of God's people when He frees Israel from Egypt and takes them into the desert. There, God starts instructing the people in spiritual principles, and one of the first lessons is about resting on the 7th day. In the story from Exodus 16, God instructs the people to collect their daily food portion, but on Friday, they must gather twice as much because no food will be provided on the Sabbath. This shows that the concept of the Sabbath was being introduced even before it was formally established in the 10 Commandments, indicating that God desired His people to live differently from other nations, depending on His provision rather than on their own efforts. When the law was given, the Sabbath was officially instituted in a serious manner, as seen in Exodus 28:11. God instructs, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy." This commandment was not only about taking physical rest, it also reminded people to place their complete trust in God. While other nations were busy working non-stop to secure their livelihood, Israel was expected to pause and acknowledge that their support came from the Lord. Here we see an important principle. The Sabbath rest was not merely a ritual, but a declaration of faith. Furthermore, the Sabbath was set up as a unique sign between God and Israel, as stated in Exodus 31:6-17. God declares that this covenant should remain forever between Him and the children of Israel. This detail leads us to ask, if the Sabbath was a sign between God and the Jews, does that imply it did not apply to other people? Some scholars contend that it did not, as the Gentiles were not required to observe it, while others believe that the Sabbath is a universal principle that was simply formalized as a commandment for Israel. It is also worth noting that observing the Sabbath had a social dimension, as seen in Deuteronomy 5:15. God reminds the Israelites that they were once slaves in Egypt, and now they should also allow their servants and foreigners to have rest. The Sabbath served as a reminder of the release provided by divine grace and of the importance of caring for one's neighbor. This shows that besides being a day of rest, it carried an important spiritual message: to trust in God and live according to His principles. However, a curious detail in biblical history is that there were times when the people of Israel entirely ignored the Sabbath. Jeremiah and Ezekiel warned that disobedience to this commandment would bring judgment upon the people. In Jeremiah 17:21-27 and Ezekiel 22:13, the Sabbath is described as a mark of faithfulness to God, and neglecting it was seen as a sign of spiritual separation. This emphasizes that the commandment was not just a cultural practice, but carried significant spiritual importance. Even though it is a strongly emphasized commandment in the Old Testament, the Bible does not mention figures like Adam, Noah, or Abraham observing the Sabbath. This brings up an interesting question. If the Sabbath was meant for everyone from the beginning, why are there no clear records of it being observed before Moses? Some argue that the silence in the Scriptures does not imply that it was ignored, only that it was not documented. Others hold that the Sabbath was established specifically for Israel as part of the Mosaic covenant and was not intended as a requirement for the Gentiles. This discussion prompts us to consider the nature of the Sabbath. Is it an exclusive law for the Jews or a principle meant for everyone who follows God? In any case, the Sabbath always pointed to something more than just weekly rest. It signified trust, release, and a stronger connection with the Creator. Moving on to the New Testament, we see a new perspective on the Sabbath emerging. Jesus Christ, who maintained an excellent relationship with God, offers unexpected teachings about that day, challenging the interpretations held by religious leaders. But was he doing away with the Sabbath, or was he simply restoring its true meaning? The second point to consider is, what did Jesus do on the Sabbath? Did he violate the commandment, or did he give it a new significance as recorded in the Gospels? One of the most controversial topics between Jesus and the religious leaders was how he handled the Sabbath. The Pharisees strictly observed this commandment and established many rules to make sure no one violated it. But then Jesus appeared, healing the sick, letting his disciples pick grain, and teaching in a way that appeared to challenge the religious system of his time. Was he really breaking God's law, or was he just challenging a misinterpreted version of it? This question is essential for understanding the full extent of Christ's message. When Jesus stated in Mark 2:27 that the Sabbath was made for people and not people for the Sabbath, he made clear a truth that the religious leaders had overlooked. God did not design the Sabbath to be a heavy load, but rather a gift. However, the Pharisees turned that day into a heavy burden with such strict rules that even healing a sick person was considered a breach of the law. Imagine a man with a withered hand standing before Jesus in the synagogue, while the Pharisees watched closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. For them, strict adherence to the law took priority over human suffering. Yet, with compassion, Jesus heals the man and asks, "Is it right on the Sabbath to do good, or is it wrong to do harm, to save a life or to take one?" Mark 3:4. Jesus' answer was unmistakable. The Sabbath was never meant for strict, lifeless rules, but was about mercy, restoration, and life. On multiple occasions, he healed on the Sabbath, including the instance of the woman who had been bent over for 18 years, Luke 13:10-17, and the paralytic by the pool of Bethesda, John 5:9. Each of these healings delivered a strong message. Jesus came to free, to restore, and to provide the true rest that only God can offer. By healing on the Sabbath, he showed that the day was not simply for stopping physical work, but for achieving physical, emotional, and spiritual renewal. Another important moment happened when the disciples were crossing a field and started picking heads of grain to eat. This caused anger among the Pharisees, who accused Jesus of permitting the violation of the Sabbath. However, he reminded them of an incident involving David and the showbread, 1 Samuel 21-16. What was Jesus implying? That human need always takes precedence over empty rituals. If even David, one of the greatest kings of Israel, was allowed to eat the sacred bread when he was hungry, why should the disciples not be allowed to take care of their own needs on the Sabbath? Throughout his ministry, Jesus did not violate God's law. Instead, he questioned the human traditions that had been added to it. He re-established the true purpose of the Sabbath, whereas the Pharisees used the day as a method for control and judgment. Jesus used it to demonstrate God's love and grace. His aim was not to remove the Sabbath, but to clarify its true purpose. The clearest proof of this is found in his own words. "My Father is still working, and I am working." John 5:17. This indicates that true rest is not confined to one day. It is about an ongoing relationship with God. However, Jesus' perspective on the Sabbath was not accepted by the religious leaders, for any deviation from tradition was seen as a challenge to their authority. The confrontation between Jesus and the Pharisees illustrates a significant spiritual lesson. When strict religiosity outweighs love for one's neighbor, the true focus is lost. God never intended his commandments to be unmanageable burdens. Rather, they are meant to be paths to life. This teaching of Jesus prompts an interesting question. If he gave the Sabbath a new meaning, does that imply he was paving the way for a change in how the day should be observed? The New Testament shows that after Christ's resurrection, the disciples started meeting on the first day of the week, Sunday. But why did they replace the Sabbath? Or was there something more at work? Answering this question gives us a clearer picture of the purpose of the Sabbath. If Jesus came to complete the law and provide a superior rest, then true rest was not confined to one day of the week, but extended into a new reality with God. This means that those who trust in Christ have already experienced the rest that the Sabbath represented. So, what is the role of the Sabbath for Christians today? The third point to consider is, what does the New Testament teach about the Sabbath for Christians after Jesus' resurrection? Something noteworthy occurred. The disciples and the early church began gathering on the first day of the week, Sunday, to celebrate Christ's victory over death. This change was not a direct command, but rather a reflection of the new spiritual condition that arose with the resurrection. In Acts 27, we read that the disciples gathered on the first day of the week to share a meal and listen to Paul's preaching. In 1 Corinthians 16:2, Paul also notes that collections for the needy should be taken on that day. Does this mean that the Sabbath was replaced by Sunday? This issue has sparked debates over the centuries. Some argue that the Sabbath remains a commandment for everyone, while others contend that in Christ the Sabbath has been fulfilled and does not need to be observed in the same manner. Paul clearly addresses this subject in Colossians 2:16-17. Therefore, do not allow anyone to judge you based on what you eat or drink, or in relation to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day, which are all mere shadows of what was to come. The true reality, however, is found in Christ. He teaches that the Sabbath was a symbol of something far more significant, and that something is Christ. The book of Hebrews expands on this idea even more by discussing a superior rest. In Hebrews 4, the author explains that true rest is not limited to one day of the week, but is a spiritual state for those who believe. Hebrews 4:9-10 states that a Sabbath rest still awaits the people of God. Anyone who enters God's rest also ceases from their own work, just as God did from his. This means that the Sabbath, as a literal day, pointed to something more significant, the rest we experience in Christ. If the Sabbath served as a symbol and was completed in Jesus, how should Christians approach it? Should we still designate a specific day to rest and worship God? The answer may differ depending on one's perspective. Romans 14:5-6 provides a key principle. One person may view one day as more sacred than another, while someone else may see all days as equal. Each individual should be convinced in their own mind that what truly matters is not the day itself, but the meaning we assign to it and our dedication to the Lord. The key point is that true rest does not arise from one specific day, but from a life committed to Jesus Christ. Today, many live at a hectic pace, always busy, anxious, and worried. Yet the rest God offers goes far beyond merely taking one day off from work each week. He wants us to step into a state of faith, trusting Him completely. Matthew 11:28-29 presents one of Jesus' most compelling promises. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Does this imply that there is no longer any need to set aside a day for God? Not at all. Designating a day for rest, reflection, and worship remains valuable. However, the emphasis should be on communion with God rather than simply following a rule. Whether it is on the Sabbath, on Sunday, or another day, what truly matters is that this time is devoted to strengthening our relationship with God and refreshing our faith. Furthermore, we must remember that the core purpose of the Sabbath has always been to trust in God. In the Old Testament, the Israelites were required to rest on the seventh day to remember that God was their provider. That principle still holds true today. Often, we try to handle everything on our own, but God calls us to trust Him. True rest is not found in a calendar. It is found in a life dedicated to God's will. Therefore, the key question is not whether we should observe the Sabbath or Sunday, but whether we are truly resting in God. Are we trusting Him, or are we living overwhelmed, attempting to solve everything by ourselves? Are we making time for our spiritual life, or are we allowing the concerns of the world to distract us from Him? The rest that God desires for us exceeds a fixed day of the week. He wants us to live every day in His presence. Regardless of how you view the Sabbath, the most important thing is to keep your heart focused on God. The New Testament teaches that the Sabbath was a symbol of Christ, and now we have access to true rest in Him. This does not mean that we should not set aside time for God. Rather, our worship and devotion should extend beyond a single day to our entire life with Christ. Now that you know the three biblical truths about the Sabbath, the question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Has your view of the Sabbath changed? Do you believe that we should continue to observe it, or that we have already found true rest in Christ? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this video has enlightened you, give it a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any more messages that can improve your walk with God. Turn on notifications, because in the upcoming videos we will go further into subjects that your church has not discussed. And if you wish to continue learning, click on the video on the screen. There you will learn another biblical truth that can completely modify your faith. May God bless you, and see you in the next video.